It's about time for us to begin. As we reminded ourselves last week, I will do the same again this week. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, the sacred writings which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to salvation through faith, which is in Jesus Christ. We are going back in Exodus to remind us of these things and give us great confidence as we look forward to our salvation, by being reminded how God has always taken care of his people and has always had a plan for his people. We will continue our study picking up in Exodus chapter 5, trying to get through all the way to the 9th plague on Exodus chapter 10, where Mike will pick up next week with the last plague in the Exodus. So let's go ahead and begin. We've got a lot to kind of go through today. I will do my best to be able to accomplish all of this. Let's go ahead and begin in Exodus chapter 5. We'll read 1 through 9. And afterwards, Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I shall obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Otherwise, he will fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why do you draw the people away from their work? Get back to your labors." And again Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now many, and you would have them cease from their labors." So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters over the people and their foremen, saying, "You are no longer to give the people straw to make brick, which they were making previously. You shall impose on them, you are no longer to give them the straw to make brick as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the quota of bricks which they were making previously, you shall impose on them. You are not to reduce any of it, because they are lazy. Therefore they cry out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Let the labor be heavier on men, and let them work at it, so that they will pay attention to the false words." This is the first recorded account that we have, the conversation, communication between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh. And what is the message that they bring to Pharaoh? What does God ask Moses to do or to say? So we look here in chapter 5, verse 1. It's a very simple request by God. Let my people go. Well, to do what? In verses 1 and verses 3, we see God's request to Pharaoh to let his people go. We don't even see that he's asking at this point that they be removed from their captivity, but just the idea of letting them go so they, in verse 1, may celebrate a feast with me in the wilderness, and in verse 3, that they might go in the wilderness to make sacrifice to him. What's Pharaoh's response to this simple request? In verse 2, you'll read, and just keep Exodus open all day. We'll be there just flipping through each chapter. We'll jump into Daniel a little bit too, but primarily be just in these chapters in Exodus. In verse 2, the question from Pharaoh is, well, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord. If you remember back in Exodus chapter 3, this was one of his concerns and questions they had for God, thinking this would be God's people questioning, well, what if they ask who the Lord is? You remember back in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, we're introduced to Exodus here in Egypt after Joseph's time has passed. And it says there was a new king that arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Remember, they were in captivity or in Egypt for about 430 years. Of course, this Pharaoh that we're reading about in chapter 5 is not the same one that we read in chapter 1. Because according to Exodus chapter 4, verse 19, all the men who were seeking Moses' life are dead. He was told that in Exodus chapter 2, verse 15, when God was speaking to him. And when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. This is at least the second, maybe another Pharaoh from Exodus chapter 1. So what's the significance here when this Pharaoh does not know the Lord, or even the significance of not knowing who Joseph was? In Genesis chapter 41, verses 38 through 41, we'll read part of this significance. Then Pharaoh said, beginning in verse 38, then Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, speaking of Joseph, in whom is a divine spirit? This is after Joseph was able to answer the things that Pharaoh needed in his dream. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one discerning and as wise as you are. So you shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. And Pharaoh then said to Joseph, see, I have set over you all the land of Egypt. And in Genesis chapter 47, verse 20, Joseph then bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. For every Egyptian sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. This is also the same time we will read later about part of the division of the land of Egypt. But in Genesis chapter 47, verse 27, this is also the same time period that Joseph had acquired the land for Israel in the land of Goshen. And in verse 27 of 47, Israel was fruitful and became very numerous. So what's the significance of Joseph? Not knowing Joseph, no longer knows the God of Joseph. And he no longer understands the land that he is in, the land that he owns, is what Joseph had bought for Pharaoh through his God. Number two of Pharaoh's response to letting God's people go. Why do you, Moses and Aaron, draw the people away from their work? Let them get back to their laborers, according to verse 4. And then also, look, the people of the land are now many. Would you have them cease from their labors? We understand Egypt to be possibly the greatest empire, at least at this time. And the Israelites were the task force, the workers. So why, now that they have grown a multitude, would you have them stop from building my Egypt? Chapter 5, we'll see the dynamics, the working dynamics of this relationship, the task force, the workers, the relationship to Pharaoh, who was king, who understood that sometimes to be that of a lowercase god. He then had taskmasters who seemed to be Egyptian. That would be his communication through the foremen, that would be the Israelites, that then would take that message to the servants, the workers, the slaves, the Israelite nation. The result here, the first request of letting my people go, is found here through chapter 5. In verse 9, they were given what? Heavier labor. And then in verse 14, the foremen were beaten for what? For they weren't making enough quota, because why? They didn't have the straw that they were once supplied. Remember, this request then made Pharaoh mad, thought that they were lazy, thought that they had more time than they needed to even consider about going to worship this God. I'm going to make your work harder. I'm going to take away the things that I was providing you. Number 3, we see that Israelites would be killed, or at least in verse 21, they are fearful of it. They question Moses, why would you put a sword in their hand to kill us? Because that which was being asked to produce the same amount of brick, the same quota, was unattainable. And then the fifth response here of this request, the Israelites then sadly blame Moses and Aaron found in verse 20. And back now to the relationship, the conversation that Moses has with God. In verse 22, Moses returned to the Lord and he said, O Lord, why hast thou brought harm to this people? And why did you send me? Chapter 6, we will read and be reminded of some of Moses' original hesitations. In verse 12, we will see that the sons of Israel have not listened to me. Then how will Pharaoh listen to me? This is the conversation that Moses is now having here with God, asking him, why did you send me? And God has said here, now watch what I will do to Pharaoh. You'll read that in chapter 6, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I shall do to Pharaoh, for under compulsion, he shall let them go, and for under compulsion, he shall drive them out of his land. According to verse 12, the sons of Israel have not listened to me, and how then will Pharaoh listen to me? Moses is questioning God, for I again, am unskilled in speech. In verse 30, Moses says before God, behold, I am unskilled in speech. How then will Pharaoh listen to me? God responds to Moses here in Exodus chapter 7, verse 3. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply the signs and the wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh will not listen to you, I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my host, my people, my sons of Egypt. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. But to give him this promise or this hope of answering Moses' questions, and to be reminded of the same promise that God gave Moses in Exodus chapter 3 and Exodus chapter 4, we have statements in chapter 6 of his promises and his statements and his reaffirmation of what God is going to do and his promises, that he might be strengthened as he goes into Exodus chapter 7, approaching Pharaoh. In verse 5 of chapter 6, he says, God tells Moses again, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel, his people. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, in verse 6. I will deliver you from their bondage, in verse 6. I will redeem you, verse 6. I will take care of you, verse 7. And I will take you to the promised land, verse 8. And as I read again earlier, let's read again Exodus chapter 7, beginning there in verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, see, I will make you as a god to Pharaoh and your brother Aaron, and you shall be a prophet. And you shall speak all that I command you and your brother Aaron, and you shall speak to Pharaoh, and he will let the sons of Israel go out of the land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. This idea of hardening Pharaoh's heart in study seems to be much more complex than I understood, or at least problematic for many. You will see that some people question this idea of God's relationship and God's role in hardening Pharaoh's heart. What does this mean? Some people have struggled over this idea Some people have left the faith thinking that there's a predestination, that God predetermines those who He will have a part of His people and those that He will condemn to hell. So let's study here just a little bit of this idea of Pharaoh's heart and God's role and Pharaoh's role and Moses' role and the role of truth as it pertains to Pharaoh's heart. Listed here we have, at least through Exodus, the idea of the heart of Pharaoh. Let's just read here kind of quickly through this outline, the heart of Pharaoh and what has happened to it. Pay attention to what has happened to it. Who has caused what to his heart? And what has been some of the result? Going back to chapter 4, verse 21, the first instance that we see is God's telling Moses again what he's going to do to bring his people out. I will harden his heart so that he will not let my people go. Chapter 7, verse 3, I will harden Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and my wonders. And when he will not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt. 7 verse 13, yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord says. And again, as we study, and we can study this for a whole quarter easily, even if we go into Revelation chapter 2, what's the important is the conversation to the churches. He who has an ear, let him hear. There's a continued pattern here that Pharaoh closes his ears and he will not listen to God. 7:14, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn and he refuses to let my people go. 22, Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he did not listen to them, Moses and Aaron. Exodus chapter 8, verse 14, when Pharaoh saw relief, he hardened his heart and he did not listen to them. Verse 19, Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he did not listen to them. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also. Chapter 9, verse 12, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and he did not listen to them. Verse 34, Pharaoh sinned again and hardened his heart. And it includes at this point he and his servants also. Chapter 5, verse 35, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Chapter 10, 1, I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants. Why? This is God speaking, that I may perform these signs of mine. 11, verse 10, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Chapter 14, verse 14, thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Why? That the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. There are four statements that are true with Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. 2, the words that Moses spoke hardened Pharaoh's heart. The third, Moses hardened Pharaoh's heart. And the fourth, God had hardened Pharaoh's heart. I think it's important as we look at these, the timeline of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and for what purpose. Let's consider a couple things here about God before we move past this so we don't misunderstand, again, that God has created someone for hell without the idea of free will. God has always been and is not a respecter of persons. Acts 10, verse 34. He says, I most certainly understand now that God is not one to show partiality, but in every nation the man who fears him and who does what is right is welcome unto him. Deuteronomy chapter 30 or verse 6. Moses is warning the same people here that God is bringing out of Egypt in his last words. Deuteronomy chapter 30 verse 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul so that you may live. Continuing that same speech that Moses has, picking up in verse 16 and verse 17. I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. But, in verse 17, if your heart turns away and you will not obey, but are drawn away and worship other gods, lowercase, and serve them, verse 18, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. God understands and he knows the heart of man. Jeremiah 17, verse 5. Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in mankind and makes his flesh strength, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. The heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give to each man according to his ways, according to the results of his deeds. God does not act unjustly. Romans chapter 9, 14 through 24. Feel free to turn there, beginning in verse 14. Now shall we say that there is no injustice with God? Is there? May it never be. For Moses says, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it does not depend on man who wills or the man who runs, but only on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, and that my might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. So then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens those who he desires. Well, then you will say, verse 19, well, why does he still find fault for the one that resists his will? On the contrary, who are you, O man, that answers back to God? The thing that molded will not say to the molder, why do you make this will of it? Or does not the potter have the right over the clay to make the same lump one vessel, for honorable use and another for common use? For what if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath to make his power known, endured with such patience the vessels of wrath which have been prepared for destruction? And he did so to make known the riches of glory upon the vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand the glory, even us, for whom he also called, not from among Jews, but also from among the Gentiles. God is a just judge. He is a God of mercy. James 1, 13 through 15 reminds us, let no one say when he is tempted that I am being tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Daniel 2, another instance of another kingdom and another use of God's tool for his purpose. We can find in Daniel chapter 2, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for the wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes the kings and he establishes the kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to the men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in darkness, and the light dwells only with him. Romans 13:1, the struggle of who puts who into what place. Every person is being subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. For those which exist are established by God. Job 12, verse 23, he makes the nations great, and he destroys them. And he enlarges the nations, then leads them away. You remember Daniel in chapter 5. We'll read a little bit here and parallel this completely to Pharaoh. And see that the kings have choices. And they'll be used based on their choices for God's use. Picking up in verse 18 of Daniel chapter 5. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father, who was king. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men everywhere of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed, Nebuchadnezzar, and whomever he wished, he spared alive, and whomever he wished, he elevated, and whoever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud, and behaved arrogantly, he was disposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts. And his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys, and he was given grass to eat like cattle, almost like the prodigal son. And his body was drenched with the dew of the heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, have been drinking from wine from them. And you have praised the gods lowercase, of silver and gold and bronze, wood and stone, which you do not see, hear, or even understand. But the God in whose hand are your life and breath and all your ways, you have not glorified. And in verse 24 of Daniel 5. Then the hand was sent down from him, and there was this inscription written out. And what did the inscription read? It meant, and Daniel gave this to Belshazzar, God has numbered your kingdom, and he has put an end to it. You have been weighed on the scales, and you have been found deficient. Your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. 29, and Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold on his neck, and they issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler over the kingdom. He understood that God was in charge, and in his place, he was there because of God. What does this mean? Let's bring this back to Exodus chapter 7, verse 13. Yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. And after seeing Aaron's staff swallow all the other magicians' staff, with all his magicians and all their secret arts, it then brings us to what? To the first plague that God said would have to happen before his people came out. Under compulsion, chapter 6, verse 1 says. Here are the 10 plagues. Water to blood, frogs of the land, gnats or not lice, swarms of insect, death of livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the death of firstborn. I'll leave that for you, Mike, next week. But to get there, there is a path. And we're going to look at the idea of what was God's request to Pharaoh each time. Sometimes we'll see that there was not a verbal request. What the plague was, what the purpose of each plague was, who it affected, and what was the result of each plague. Because this only tells us Pharaoh's heart, the Egyptians, the Israelites, and the relationship with God and the knowledge of who he was, leading to the Exodus, leading to understanding that God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac is the God that will lead them in the cloud and through the pillar of fire, through the wilderness. But before we get there, we need to have confidence that this is God, the Almighty, calling us into the Exodus. So let's look here first at the first plague. Bear with me here. We'll just go through kind of quickly. I think maybe our time is running out a little bit. The first plague we will see in Exodus chapter 7, and you'll be able to read that beginning verse 16. God's request here, I've kind of underlined, The same request that he went first to with Pharaoh. The same request that will be repeated. God's request is not changing. Let my people go, that they may serve me. Well, what was this plague that was about to happen in the land of Egypt? Verses 17 through 19 of chapter 7, you'll read, but the water was to become blood. You also remember this is one of the signs that God gave Moses to identify that God was with Moses, with the elders, as he took water from the Nile, went on the dry land, and it became blood. Well, we see that water, the Nile, the heartbeat of Egypt, was to become blood. And not just the Nile, as you read in 17 and 19, but the waters of Egypt, the rivers, the streams, the pools, the reservoirs. Any vessel that had water contained blood. Well, what was this purpose of this first plague? What was God trying to accomplish? In verse 17, by this, meaning Pharaoh, you shall know that I am the Lord. Because it's also interesting, and maybe a side note, how many signs does it take for this world, for you, for me, for the Israelites, for Pharaoh, to know that there is one true living God? And this is the God that we are speaking about. Again, as we open up the beginning of this class with 2 Timothy chapter 3, 15, this leads us into the wisdom. What wisdom? We have the evidence. We know what the next plague is going to be. We know the results. We don't have the excuse of not knowing the end of the story. Who this affected, the first plague? It affected everyone. Everyone in Egypt, the borders of Egypt here, it affected. Their water supply was taken. What was the result? Well, the fish died in the Nile. And because of this, the Nile became foul in its aroma. 7 verse 21. The Egyptians found difficulty getting water. You'll see that they'll dig by the Nile to try and find the water table. Number 3, however, the magicians did the same with their secret arts. You can read lots of articles about this and what does this mean? Did they have some miraculous gift? Was there some sorcery of hidden powers and trickery? And there was some ability that they were able to grab the right type of cobra by the neck and it would become stiff and look like a rod. I'll let you continue to study that upon yourself, and I'll just simply read what we have here. Their same secret arts. They then tried to match Noah. Number 4, the result of the first plague. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to this. And he turns his back on this. By what? He went back into his house, and he had no concern. 7 verses 22 through 23. The second plague that we then see, God again asked Moses to Aaron to go to Pharaoh in chapter 8, verse 1 to do what? To ask again, Pharaoh, let my people go that they may serve me. 7 days, you have the water that was continuing to be blood. Then you have frogs over the land, chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. For what purpose? You find in verse 10. And as you read through, you'll see the frogs came out of the Nile and they were everywhere. But the purpose, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. Why? Gift did a great job kind of introducing the idea that this was a kingdom or a land filled with lowercase gods. They had one for everything. Well, maybe if we have enough time, look at some of those. Well, who did it affect? It affected the whole territory, everyone. According to chapter 8, verse 2, they were all smitten with frogs. There was no reprieve in the ovens, in the households, all over the land. What was the result? Chapter 8, verse 6. The frogs came up and they covered the land of Egypt. Chapter 8, verse 7. Again, the magicians did the same thing with their secret arts. I don't know how you could prove that if the frogs were coming out everywhere. I think I could say, come up, frogs, and they were coming up anyways. But their secret arts seem to be able to do the same thing. Number 3 of the result. Pharaoh asked the Lord to remove the frogs, and I will let your people go. You see the first hope that this might be working. Moses, again, as he had questioned God in chapter 6, why did you send me here? These people aren't we're still here. I'll let the people go, verse 8. And then number 4, when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, when the frogs had been piled up, when they were no longer growing in number except in the Nile, he had hardened his heart. Pharaoh had hardened his heart, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. We're going to find here in the first 5 plagues that Pharaoh hardened his heart. Third plague, kind of go through here quick. We got gnats in the land of Egypt, verses 16 through 17. Well, who did it affect? It affected all the land of Egypt. There were gnats on man and there was gnats on beast. The result, the magicians tried to do the same secret arts, but this is the first time that they could not. And this is also the last time that you will see them attempting to try to do the things that God Almighty wants. Then the magician said, this is the finger of God. Now you have another group of people understanding who this is. Number 2, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And again, he did not listen to them. Our 4th plague, the swarm of insects. Let my people go. God's request again comes to Pharaoh, that they may serve me. What was the purpose of this plague? That you, Pharaoh, may know that I am the Lord, and I am in the midst of this land, according to verse 22. And also for the land and its people, verse 23, to understand this, that there is a division between Egypt and God's people. Or he will put a division between them. And this we begin to see how these plagues affected God's people and Pharaoh's people differently. Verse 21, Pharaoh, his servants, his people, his houses, and the houses of the Egyptians were all affected by the swarms of insects, but not in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites live. Remember we looked a little earlier? The land that Joseph bought is still where the Israelites live. And the result that we see is Pharaoh again telling Moses that I will let you go and sacrifice the Lord your God and make supplication. Here's a new idea. Now when you go make a supplication to your God for me, understanding that supplication needed to happen. But like all the 3 before, Pharaoh hardened his heart, this time also, and he did not let the people go. Coming up to the 5th plague, this idea of severe pestilence. God's request again, let my people go that they may serve me. And a severe pestilence fell on all the livestock. The purpose, to help set there is a definitive timeline for God and his purposes. What and who was affected? All the livestock in Egypt died. In Egypt proper. All the livestock survived by those of the sons of Israel. So much that Pharaoh went to look because he was amazed that not even one died. However, the same result happens. The heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. Then the 6th plague we see, Moses was commanded to throw the soot from the kiln up into the air, and when it would come down, to be flying dust particles and land and become boils on Egypt. And do this, what? In the sight of Pharaoh, according to 9 verse 8, so that Pharaoh can physically see these things happen. Who it affected? It affected man, beast, magicians, all in the land of Egypt. So much that the magicians, The result, could not stand before Moses because of their boils. And then the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart because he did not listen to them. Our seventh plague, heavy hail, so much that it has never been seen. And as you study that, look, there'll be heavy hail and thundering and lightning. Let my people go, verse 13 of chapter 9. Why? So that they may know that there is no one like me, God Jehovah, on the earth, and that I will show you my power, and for God to proclaim his name through all the earth. It affected every man, beast, anything left in the field. However, we see a little change here in this plague. Any of the servants of Pharaoh's that heard this and feared the word of the Lord, according to verse 20, and acted on it, it did not affect. What was the result? Pharaoh, who said, I have sinned, is understanding a little bit of God's power and word. The Lord is the righteous one, and I and my people are the wicked ones. Make supplication again to the Lord that there has been enough of God's thunder and hail. And what do we see? Pharaoh sinned again, and Pharaoh hardened his heart, and his servants, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let the sons of Israel go again. God's request on this eighth plague, how long, Pharaoh, will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go that they may serve me. And then we have the locusts and all the territory. Never had there been so many, because there had been locusts or beetles. Nor would there be any of that magnitude ever again. Why? So Moses could tell his sons and his grandsons how he, God, made a mockery of the Egyptians. And so we can understand God's power and what he has done for us. And also that you, Moses, and the Israelites may know that I am the Lord your God. Let all these plagues be known to us that he is our God, the Lord of all. It affected all the Egyptians, according to chapter 10. The locust ate all the rest of whatever escaped from the hail. Nothing green was left, according to verse 15. Pharaoh's servants requested Pharaoh to let these people go, that they may finally serve their God. And then they identify what the landscape of the land is to Pharaoh. In verse 7, do you not recognize that Egypt is destroyed? That which was once great, it's destroyed. God's finger and power has destroyed Egypt. Pharaoh, again, his response, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now please forgive my sin and make supplication for me. Moses heard this before. God has heard this before. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the sons of Israel go. This ninth and final plague here is the darkness of the land of Egypt, a darkness which may be felt, according to verse 21. We're not given here the purpose, but we do understand the effect. All the land of Egypt for 3 days was dark, but not in Israel. Not in Goshen, for all the sons of Israel had light in their dwellings. What was the result? They did not see one another, the Egyptians, for 3 days. No one arose from his place for 3 days. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let these people go. And then the last meeting face-to-face that Pharaoh has with Moses. Pharaoh says to Moses, get away from me. Beware, do not see my face again. For in the day you shall see my face, you will die. And Moses said, you are right. I will never see your face again. What happens next? We will see God's greatness, his power, his promise, and his prophecy fulfilled. Come with us next week as Mike brings us the idea of the Exodus of Israel with the 10th and final plague. Thank you for being a part of this class today.